Bird. Very exciting. Um, Again, I would like to welcome everyone. Thank you very much. This is the last in the series. Do I see tears forming anywhere? Not really, but I'll pretend. The idea of the series was to be able to kind of introduce some basic principles of diversity as a starting place, what it means to be responsible or to like improve the consciousness of what we are unconscious of, be it both positive and negative bias. The third webinar that we did last week, I actually chose anatomical and biological sex parts and bits, gender identity, expression, roles, sexual orientation or sexual identity, and how that fits in with different forms of oppression, to do kind of a deeper dive, for lack of a better words, into a particular identity or lived experience and how all these different kind of diversity and bias pieces show up, so that we can have a conversation about how our role individually is and isn't easy, is and isn't hard, why sometimes it's easier to engage in some conversations and why there are others that we like slowly back away from. There's others that we like cross our fingers that we hope we never have to engage with. So the last piece of the series is called Being a Better Ally. And I use this language on purpose because I believe every single person is probably a mediocre to fantastic ally to someone at some point in time. Now, I may sound like Rumsfeld when I say that, but I don't know each one of you well enough to know what you're really good at advocating for, what you're really good at being an ally for, because I also don't know your own identities, your own lived experience. I don't even know y'all's names, right? So I can't know everything. But I do think it's important not to like gloss over that co-conspirator kind of work is actually really hard and it's really challenging, and there is a very high level of risk involved in being an accomplice to dismantling systems of oppression. I want to be able to talk about that while also holding the reality that like your closest friends, your closest family, when you kind of, I call it mama bear mode, when you can like immediately something happens and you are launching and taking that risk because you are called to take that risk, that matters. And it's the same skill set. I just believe that in order to be kind of better, you need to be able to notice what you can like automatically bust into mama bear mode with, and where you might need a little bit more help and why those differences exist. So the idea of today is not to make you an ally for all, because I don't know what your beliefs are, your values are, etc. This is not an agenda shoving kind of situation. But what I want to do is make you have the space to find out where you already are, where you want to be, where you don't want to be, and what you don't even realize you either do or don't want to be. That's the process. As a reminder, you're welcome to text message me at 202-670-4262, even if you're watching the recording. You can also use the chat space if you need to. The idea of allyship is really at the base listening skills. Now, we can have a very like robust conversation about what is the difference between an ally, an advocate, an accomplice, a co-conspirator, etc. There will be new words. But at the base of it, it's taking responsibility for what you are capable of doing and doing something from where you are capable of doing something at a greater risk than not doing anything. So when we start talking about being an ally, often I get asked a pretty common series of questions. And the first one is well, what is the goal? Why would I need to do this? And for some, this is kind of the defense making argument of that, like you have to give up some of your pie in order to give it to somebody else. Fun facts, there is pie for everybody. And what we're really talking about is who has the power to like dole out the pie and have the ability to customize the pie for like gluten-free folks, etc. There's a system in place that impacts all of us. And that is the goal, is to actually utilize a system that actually honors all of us instead of potentially silencing or marginalizing some of us, not all of us. So if we talk about the goal, I want to use business as kind of the metaphor, but I really also want you to notice how much yourself as an individual comes in. So when we talk about HR practices or federally protected groups, I think there's a part of us that automatically knows discrimination is bad for business. So, yeah, sure. It's also illegal, at least to like 8 different categories on a federal level, depending on what state you're in. That may also vary. But discrimination in itself is actually discernment, right? So, if you as an organization are trying to decide what kind of marketing dollars you're going to spend, you're going to discern where to spend those dollars, how to do marketing, who to target, who not to target. You're not going to target people who don't need physical therapy. You're not going to target people maybe who aren't athletic. Maybe you narrow down all the people in the universe who need physical therapy to athletes. Well, what kind of athletes? Maybe you target long distance or endurance athletes. That in itself is also called discrimination because you're actually taking the whole universe, which you do not have the capacity to serve, and making a choice as to who you're actually going to serve. The discrimination that's bad for business is specifically unconscious, unchecked, unrationalized, and or illegal discrimination. But because of like bad diversity trainings, we're often like, oh no, everybody 100% can't discriminate against anybody anywhere. What if they can't pay their bill? Yeah, you can refuse service to people. Isn't that discrimination? So then we get to responsibility, where when you start thinking about who automatically gets in and who automatically gets out and what those policies are and what those practices are, now you're taking responsibility for those choices. So you don't want to apologize because you're open. But on an individual level, this happens all the time. All the time. We'll be doing something and somebody will correct you in a pronunciation or pronouns, or you told a joke or you used an idiom that has like a inappropriate history, and we go, oh my god, I'm so sorry, right? Like we get defensive or we pull back, etc. But instead of apologizing, you can actually just thank someone for giving you the information. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm open, and thank you for the feedback. Instead of I'm sorry and being defensive, you shouldn't have to apologize for actually engaging in a conversation with someone. What we often do is close up shop and never have conversations again. But that's actually the work of the ally. So you can't like wait until you're going to nail it, right? You know all the definitions, you know all the vocabulary words, and you get like some kind of transcript ahead of time. So you know exactly what's going to happen in the conversation, and you're going to look like a stellar winner at the end. That does not occur at all in any way. So you're going to have to actually like partake in the conversation and take some risk. Even at the base level, you're going to have to take some risk that is rooted in the judgments and assumptions you make when you begin to show up into this connection or this conversation. The work is where you start, not the answers. So similar to asking a question that you don't know the answers to, the work is the beginning place of like, all right, let's see what I don't know here. If we use the metaphor of like a client or a patient file, you don't necessarily know what's in that file until you open the file folder. You can have a whole system of where you keep your electronic medical records or old school paper files or something. You can have that system so you know the information is there somewhere, and you can be trained on how to access that information for the information that you need. And then even with that, there is still going to be the moment where you start each moment, each appointment with that individual, and you're going to have to find out what's going on. That's what I mean by listening. Now, I've used a lot of optical illusions. I tend to do that a lot because I think it's a great way of just consciously realizing that there are always at least 3 perspectives happening at once. So there's the people who see the 2 faces, there's the people who see the candlestick, and there's the artist who drew this on purpose to try to encourage you to flip back and forth and see both. So in every interaction that you have, if you can like at least look for and count for the 2 other perspectives than your own, then you're not apologizing for being open. You're actually taking responsibility to check on what are some other possibilities. What are others? It doesn't mean that they have to be right, but the more you practice with, well, what about this? Or what about this? Or what about this? Helps you kind of open up a little bit more instead of just your story, your truth, and that is it. And your truth and your story can align with someone else, but that's not high risk advocacy work. That's actually just kind of accidentally being in line with someone. The work is discerning what is going on here. Now, I really, really like this image. So if you need to, I would encourage you to take a screenshot, because at different times you can be both of these people while you're communicating. So if we use just a general example, I am a flaming extrovert. So I often am the person on the left that I'm thinking out loud. In order for me to think, it has to spew out of my cranium and be out here. And I have raucous disagreements with myself. And that is how I think. So if someone is listening to me, they know this about me. So maybe they take this giant word cloud and they synthesize it into something that is rational and makes sense to them. But that may not actually be my intention. That is my impact, but that's not necessarily my intention. They could be accurate, they could be inaccurate, but it's their habits that are making sense of my kind of word cloud habit. But it also works the other way around. I can be very intentional in my conversation, where I am now the person on the right. And I have practiced and prepared, and here is exactly what I'm going to say. And I can send that message out, and it is received as a word cloud. What? What's going on? Blah! And like the person's entire history comes out of nowhere, even though what I had said was very like planned and intentional. What's important to understand is that this is literally the root of things that we call miscommunications that can actually even be about the same topic. So it's actually not a miscommunication as much as it is a misconnection. You can be talking about exactly the same situation, exactly the same variables, and it will appear as though you were talking about different things. Some of this goes back to that head, heart, action situation, and some of it doesn't. So already this morning, it is 9:45 over here on the West Coast, and I have already engaged in a number of conversations about last night's Republican National Convention speech that Trump did on the White House lawn. And what is important to understand is that some folks see this as a very patriotic, federally authorized ability and duty of a sitting president to use federal property for these kind of things. The other side, if we stick to a binary, sees this as like a gross misuse of federal land, of symbols of democracy that represent everyone, and also against the Hatch Act that is for personal gain. Both of those things can actually be true to both of those people. And that conversation is not going to go well if people enter in different places already, but they're not miscommunicating, they're just not connecting. And you really need to understand the differences because they're both entering that conversation about the same topic, deeply rooted in their own planned, thought out things. But if they enter this conversation without listening to the other person, they are not connecting. And in order to be an ally or an advocate for someone else, you actually have to like have the humility to take your belief set, bring it with you, but set it to the side so that you can actually have a conversation and a connection with the person that you're talking to. Otherwise, it will turn into kind of a heated speech off, right? Like for some reason, I just pictured the mashup thing in Pitch Perfect, right? Where like, you're singing this and you're waiting for the right song and now you can say this thing, where it creates interesting music combinations. That's not an actual connection. That's not building a deeper relationship. It stays in a kind of a competitive space. If we talk about the suffering or the pain that exists from being silenced or marginalized, from being ignored, from being miscommunicated with, from being misjudged, from not being included, a lot of times when we ask like who suffers the most in these scenarios, the truth is that we can't always know. And all the different lived experiences of yourself and the person that you're trying to communicate or connect with are all going to come into play. So it's a very Buddhist principle to understand that like life is pain and suffering. Not really the best t-shirt, but it's true. And if we actually engaged with one another as if we don't know the level of pain and suffering that's happening over there, then we're actually going to show up to that connection a little bit more open, because the other person is picking and choosing what to tell us, just like we are picking and choosing what to tell them. If we burden the other person to do our education for us, then that's in addition to the pain and suffering they may already be experiencing. So one of the first things to really do is to notice, when are you comfortable doing your own homework? And when are you more comfortable sitting back and waiting for the answers to come to you? You can do something about that dynamic, but the first step is you have to recognize that dynamic exists. So when you find out about a cultural or ethnic variable, be it food or music or language or song or ritual or practice, and you've never heard of it before, what intrigues you enough to go do your own homework and learn about it, versus usually waiting for someone else or burdening someone else to have to explain to you why whatever this variable is that you're unfamiliar with is important enough for you to actually do something about it. That's at the root of the burden related to pain and suffering. This literally is exactly what being an ally isn't. So sometimes instead of being able to define what something is, we start at what it isn't. What it isn't is expecting other people to do your work for you. You then validate as important enough for you to do something about it, or not important enough for you to do something about it. That is zero risk. You're sitting on a couch receiving and evaluating something that's important enough to someone else to determine whether you want to do something about it. Now, it is also our responsibility to recognize that that is 100% how we show up some of the time. Okay, wouldn't it be a good step to at least be responsible for the times that we are showing up that way? To consciously decide, like, yeah, I don't know what to do about this, right? On a personal level, I pretty much shut down when anybody starts talking to me about doing things that injure animals. Can't do it. Like, I don't have a conversation. Now, if I'm talking about laboratory testing, product testing, animal abuse, animal fighting, or something like this, there's kind of different nuances that are under the umbrella of hurting animals. And generally, some of them I have gotten slightly more comfortable with, and some of them I'm still very, very, very uncomfortable with. But if we were to talk about hunting, I grew up in Texas. My entire family are hunters. I'm completely comfortable talking about hunting. Why is hunting not harming animals? That's something in me that I'm responsible for, because I have put the things under different umbrellas, largely because it's informed by my lived experience. There are a million other examples of this where this is totally okay or comfortable for me to talk about, and this makes me shut down and I can't engage. But I'm responsible for recognizing that pattern. That is the work. So how do you do it? Like, how do you prepare? How do I sit around and like notice which umbrella groups I'm comfortable with and which umbrella groups I'm not comfortable with? Well, that's actually a really hard question, which is why most of us don't do it. But the idea of taking responsibility for yourself, I call leaving room for edits. What I mean by this is whatever category you want to take, this is your self-work, but you write a story because it makes you feel safe and prepared. Okay, so if we take harming animals, I don't like to harm animals. That is my story. Okay, great. Whatever story you write makes you feel safe and prepared. So it's not about never making judgments and assumptions. It's about recognizing that you do. And you make judgments and assumptions so you can feel safe, so you can feel prepared. Now, whether this is like saddling up to a table to a new client and you have to pick and choose what your demeanor is going to be like, or whether you're going to need backup, or whether you don't want to work with this client, or you're super excited about working with this client even before you actually work with the client. Same thing goes with picking movie seats or who you're going to be friends with, if you're swiping left or swiping right. We write stories about what we are comfortable with. The idea of leaving room for edits is to recognize that your lived experience has informed you that this is the story you ought to write because it makes you feel the most safe and prepared. And then you print that story off triple space with extra wide margins. And with generosity and curiosity, you hand the story over and seek more accurate information. Usually we think about edits when we're writing or something like this specifically. So like when I wrote my book, for example, the first draft I gave out to, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 people, and I wanted them to destroy my book. I wanted them to find all the typos, all the comma problems, all the what the hell are you talking about? Why are you telling the story? Why are you telling the story again? Whoa, that is too much disclosure. I don't need to know this about you. And I need to know more here. What's going on? I need to know more of the details that happened in the story. I couldn't do that for myself because I was too close to the content of the book. So I printed it out, triple spaced, extra wide margins, and I handed it to people, and then I waited in like a sweaty, anxious mess to get all their feedback. If I can do that for my book, why can't I do that for another human being? Where I am conscious of the story that I have written about them, and then I excitedly wait to find out what I've done wrong so that I can become more accurate. That's like a deeply different kind of listening and engagement, but we often don't do that. But by leaving room for edits, you're acknowledging kind of what your base level story is, what assumptions you're making, what judgments you're making, and then you're providing space for their truth. That is a very different kind of listening, but you actively leave room for edits for accuracy versus this kind of competitive, I knew it, I was right? So like this kind of, if you're wiggling your head, generally speaking, there's something else going on, right? This is the rule. So if you can leave room for edits, then what you're doing is you're actually listening to their truth. Now, often when I work in like a medical setting, the concept of humility comes up a little bit more when we start talking about patient experience. And you have a ton of experience, and I don't want you to negate it, right? Like, I'm still kind of laughing at myself that when I showed the picture of Steve sitting on his wall in his house where it looks like a cliff, like not only did most people just avoid the fact that he is an amputee and has a prosthetic leg because we live in a culture where we're not supposed to talk about that, but then you eventually did talk about it, but then a door opened and your expertise came out about what was going on with his hips that weren't even in the picture. I did cut and paste that to him, by the way. I don't even know what you're talking about, but that was your expertise, right? So what's so interesting is that our lived experience makes us feel safe and prepared. Then we have the expertise that comes with our lived experience that helps us see things that other people maybe can't. But the patient experience is just that. It is a patient experience, which means you have to slow your roll down. So you show up with your individual lived experience, then you show up with your Smarty McSmarty Pants experience, and then you set it aside and have enough humility to actually have a conversation with the human being who's picking and choosing what to share with you. That is the patient experience. If we can do that with the people we work for, then we ought to be able to do this with our friends, our family members, and total strangers. I again posit that if we can do the best we can with what we got some of the time, it is better than nothing never. It's not about being right. It's about providing the space to continually become more accurate. This isn't a competition. It's about space for someone else to be seen and heard. And by providing that space, then you get to be an ally because it's about them being seen, not feeling silenced, not feeling marginalized. It's not about you knowing everything, having all the right vocabulary words and being right, and them perceiving you as a good one so that you get a blue ribbon in the mail. That is not what an ally is about. If you can take the risk and be strong enough and vulnerable enough, authentic enough, generous enough, curious enough to actually keep listening, You actually are doing the work of being an ally. But it doesn't come with the rightness or like the Girl Scout badges or whatever we kind of need in order to stay motivated. And honestly, most ally work is not going to systematically dismantle systems of oppression, but it's going to make space for that one individual that you actually have access to either provide long-term care, the ability to actually be seen in that second, even if they never see you again. By keeping it about them, you can then begin to change the story that they have written about you, because they will see your role modeling of what listening looks like. And maybe they also can provide a little bit of space for edits in the story that they have written about you. And perhaps that'll change what they disclose to you, but it'll also potentially change their lived experience in stories that they are writing about other people that are like you. That is all possible. And we know how much we like asking me questions about what about this person or how do we change this? The closest thing I can get to that answer is to do your own work. And by doing your own work, you will provide space for people to learn that around you, they get seen and heard. And if around you, they get seen and heard, then they're going to show up and say more because they're seen and heard. That's the shift. Now, again, if you have any thoughts or comments, you are welcome to text message me. The number again is 202-670-4262. As we're going through this, it is possible that you're going to start to notice when this is a little easier or a little more habitual, when this is more of a struggle, and also habitual, right? Is that because you also have a story that like, oh, I can't do this. So then the habits kick in of not doing it as much as the habits kick in of doing it. But what is it? And that's your homework. I can't help with that. But you're welcome to send me a text message as you think about it or reflect on it. So normally people like a list. So here is what I would consider a complete crap list. And what I mean by that is somebody somewhere gets very excited because it even has bullets. So here's a list. Here's some basics that you can do, except it's impossible. First one, don't use pejorative language. Well, number one, a lot of people don't even know what the word pejorative means and who gets to determine what is accessible and what isn't accessible. But like a good rule, right? Use the language of the person that you're actually talking with. Decline to gossip. Why? That's the fun part. But the gossip is often about you collecting information because especially secret information is power, which then also is very disrespectful to privacy a lot of times. Taking notes and paying attention to the language that other people use to describe themselves or their families and kind of mirroring that back to them. You're usually pretty good about this, but notice when you falter. Trying really hard not to be exclusive unintentionally versus exclusive intentionally. Looking at micro inequities or microaggressions. The hardest thing about these things is that the person doing them often is completely oblivious to doing them, but may receive feedback that like, hey, you're kind of doing this, I'm noticing this pattern. But because you don't notice it, you don't feel it's a problem. But if you're getting the feedback, then it is a problem. If you're learning about it and you haven't experienced it, just go ahead and acknowledge it's a problem you're not experiencing, not that it's not a problem and you are not experiencing it. Therefore, it is not a problem. That's a false conclusion. But if you wanted to pay attention, this would be a great thing to do. This is how you would keep me potentially unemployed. You're not going to do it because it's like impossible to do on a regular basis, but people like lists, so I made one. Remember the golden rule. The golden rule is about treating people the way you want to be treated. Sounds nice enough. But what if people don't want to be treated your way? You're going to have to engage outside of pirate-like behavior and actually find out how other people want to be treated and then adjust to how they want to be treated. That is the platinum rule. Being able to treat people the way they want to be treated. So whether this, again, is a client or a coworker or a stranger on the sidewalk or someone that you're only going to talk to once, like a customer service agent or something like that, you get to determine how they want to be treated by you, and then you should follow suit. But in order to do that, you're going to have to ask questions. You're going to have to make a connection. You're going to have to listen to the answers, and you're going to have to modify your behaviors to align with the answers to the questions that you asked. Or you just speed through all that and treat them the way you want to be treated and hope for the best. That's not ally work, but that is how most of us show up most of the time. If you want to engage in these conversations, it starts by asking questions. More importantly, it starts by asking questions that are appropriate and that you don't know the answers to. So the example that I like to use right now is, so how are you doing during this COVID time? It's like the opening of every phone call. It's the opening of every email. And the truth is, none of us are nailing this. All of us are struggling, but we might feel like we have to at least say, like, our sourdough starter isn't dead or something like that. But that's not actually a question we care about the answer to, because it's just what we now say. It's the new, how is the weather? I would say now, how is the weather is a more interesting question than how are you dealing with the COVID pandemic? Because number one, all kinds of weather stuff is happening right now, and I can't even keep up with like the fire tornadoes and whatever's happening. So that's kind of an interesting question. But what makes it an interesting question is I literally don't know the answers, right? Like the other night, it's time in COVID is weird, but the other night, I feel like there were like 30 million different hurricanes coming into the Gulf of Mexico with 5,000-mile-hour per wind. Perhaps that's slightly hyperbolic, but I should probably work for a TV station because they seem to all be Thunderdome apocalyptic disasters. So then I woke up in the morning and was like, the electricity's out. That's it. That's all that happened. It went from like 2 hurricanes to 1. Some damage has happened, but it wasn't near as bad. But I literally didn't know. I had to go find out what happened with the hurricanes. That is the practice of asking questions that you don't know the answers to. Instead, if I were to say, so, what did you think about da-da-da-da? If I'm asking someone that I already know their answer to, then all I'm doing is asking them to give me a space to tell them what I think about the thing I'm asking. That's not a conversation. That's actually really annoying. But if we're going to use the platinum rule, we need to start with appropriate questions we do not know the answers to. If we can do that, we need to listen to find out what's appropriate. We also need to know ourselves well enough to know when we are not the person to be giving them the answers, and we can make some educated referrals. Then we need to notice when do we refer out and when do we handle it ourselves, and then do our own homework around this kind of new awareness. Literally, that's the basics. This is actually doable compared to the other list, but the other list sounds sexier. It just won't occur. Well, isn't it fascinating that we prefer the list we're not going to do than the list that you are completely capable of doing, but you also rarely do it? But this is what you would need to do, is listen, ask appropriate questions, make referrals when you are not the expert, and notice the patterns of when you have to refer out or you dodge a subject, and do your own homework around that subject. That's it. End of the webinar. Just kidding. So, if you are going to engage, an entry point that I recommend is to remember that they are choosing how much to disclose to you. So let's say someone discloses something to you and you're like, whoa, I do not even know what that means. I did not know that vocabulary word. They have made a bad choice. I am not the right person to have this conversation. What would happen if you, instead of dodging the conversation, trusted that they have done an entire resource inventory of their life, and you are the lucky winner? Out of everything in their life, you are the one that they feel the safest to disclose this information to. And they may have chosen poorly. That is very true. You might be like, no, not it. No, should not be telling me these things. But if you trust that they have chosen you on purpose to disclose what they have, they are also making choices about what not to tell you. Okay. But you're connecting with them through the choices that they are making, which is a way of seeing them, not silencing them, not marginalizing them, but allowing them to make the choices and honoring the choices that they are making. I think a lot of times we don't want to disclose our whole lived experience because we think a lot of people just can't handle the truth. But it's also the case that we can't handle the truth of our own lives. And so we bento box that stuff up into the attic and try really hard not to talk about it. So when you have some kind of like spidey skill that you can look at a photograph and instantaneously know like what's happening with the rest of the skeletal system or whatever, I'm not going to pretend to know how to do your job, but you can watch someone walk in and you're like, boop, 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 way more. And they're like, yeah, my finger hurts. And you're like, really, just your finger? Because what about's going on everywhere else? Like you have the opportunity of looking like a creepy psychic person, or you're going to have to ask strategic questions that go from the finger pain to possibly other pain that they either will or will not disclose to you. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it if they choose not to disclose it to you and they don't want to work on the things that you think are actually the root problem. If they don't want to work on it, you can't do anything. You can't make them do it. Now, am I talking about physical therapy, or am I talking about political stance or religious beliefs? The answer is yes. You can't make people do anything, even if you can see things that they don't know that you can see. But you have to trust that they're choosing what to disclose to you, just like you ideally are picking and choosing what to share with them. That is actually what a real connection is about, even though by definition it might not seem like communication. Clear? Helpful? Is that resonating as far as like how y'all work at work, but also how you are outside of work? I hear Morgan is sharing that happens a lot as a PT. So it does happen a lot, but it also happens in just pick a grocery store. It doesn't just have to be at work. If you pay attention and listen, then you will notice that we all are familiar with when we haven't been listened to. We're all familiar when we haven't been paid attention to. We know what that feels like. So then why do we do it? But we do it not because we're paying attention to its impact. We do it because that's where we're showing up in that given moment. It's not like they're not aware of it. So then we just don't discuss it. But that's just building more and more and more of a misconnection than a connection. If you can ask questions respectfully and honor what they are choosing to tell you, you might get to the place where you can actually work on a root problem or something that happened throughout their life or something that's physically related to the physical therapy you're asking them to do. But it might take some time. I know whenever I go in for physical therapy, technically I am there for like my most recent injury or my most recent surgery. And my physical therapist, I live in a very small town, so there's one guy, his name is Dave. He's like a therapist more for than just my body muscles or whatever's happening or however I'm recovering from a surgery. Because I, going in, am now bringing in all of my lived long body image issues. I am bringing in being raised by professional athletes and what it even means for me to walk into a space that has a bunch of gym equipment in it. Like, that's not his fault. But that's what I'm bringing in kind of the invisible backpack with me when technically I'm just there for shoulder surgery recovery. He has to know that. How is that any different than when we're on the phone with a stranger or we're walking down an aisle of a grocery store? It's not. And we know on some level that it's not. We just like to pretend that it is. If you can remember that the other person knows themselves better than you know them, then it allows for that space for them to slowly disclose information instead of you impatiently waiting to be right. Now, there's also the cases where you will be impatiently waiting to be right because you know you're right. Sure. But notice the posturing is a little bit different, and it's not about being correct. It's about providing space for the connection. Being an ally to all is about them and less about you. That's a very important thing to remember, and it's the hardest thing to do. We like to think we know everything or that we don't know anything. But again, there's always that third option. And there's all the knowledge that exists in the universe. There's what you know you know. There's what you know you don't know, which is still technically knowledge that you know. You just know you don't know it. But then there's an ever expanding amount of knowledge that you have no idea you don't know. And that is what you slowly learn and slowly disclose to other people. Y'all know how to do your job. Great. I know I do not know how to do your job. You now, in about 2 seconds, boom, ready? You did not know that you do not know what color socks I'm wearing. Now you are aware that you do not know what color socks I'm wearing. Some of you were here when I went earlier to get coffee and you're trying to remember, could I see her socks then? I wasn't even recording. And guess what? I'm not going to show you my socks. You now know you don't know, and I just told you you're not going to know. If like starts bubbling up, notice that that's actually what entitlement feels like. Because now that you know you don't know something and it would be very easy for the unknown thing to become known, it gets competitive. And you're like, why are you still talking about this? Just, it doesn't even matter. I don't even care if you're wearing socks. The reality is that often something will trip us into where we are entitled to know all the information, only motivated because we are now aware we don't know. That is not rooted in ally or advocacy work, because it's not about everyone else. It's about you gathering information, because information is power. That is the system that has to be dismantled, regardless of social identity. When we start talking about being an ally or an advocate, you are responsible for when you feel entitled to the information, because you're like a maven collecting power versus doing something with the information or honoring that that information has been shared with you in the first place. If we notice the three different kinds of knowledge, then we can actually start paying attention to when it becomes a little bit easier for us to take a risk and do some advocacy work across difference versus kind of a competitive claim to either entitlement or ego around information so that we're righter than other people. So I'm pausing again. Other thoughts, comments, suggestions, ideas, anything I can help with? Again, the texting number is 202-670-4262. Because this is the last webinar in the series, you are welcome, i.e., please give me your ideas or questions or comments, because you're going to be very sad next Friday because we're not playing together next Friday. I do not see texts. I do not see chats. All right. We will keep going. If the next step isn't asking me questions, but is actually doing your own homework, maybe this will inspire you to ask me questions. We don't like to do homework. We don't want to take note of new terms or when the patterns of our discomfort or confusion. We don't want to do this. We want to like upload or update some kind of system overnight to go to like 7.0 format and then have all the answers. That's what we want to do. Also a form of entitlement. Doesn't happen. You have a close inner circle that you can do some sharing with, or like ask questions or get resources or referrals, or like share your own struggles and learning that you're doing in your closest inner circle. I say this on purpose because one of the things that happens quite often when being an ally or advocacy work kind of rises back up into kind of a conversation piece, which definitely happened after George Floyd's murder. What ends up happening is that specifically around race, white people will reach out to like every single black man that they know that is on their Facebook feed or on the sidewalk or in their phone and say, how are you doing? I'm here to advocate for you, which sounds like a great thing to do, except it's so disingenuous if you don't actually have a pre-existing relationship with that person. Don't be an ally because it's the cool thing to do right now, because it makes you look like a good person, or it makes you feel better, or it's a way to deal with your guilt or shame. It's actually recognizing that this work is needed year-round, daily, hourly, by the minute, and you have to trust that other people are doing it when you're like, dude, I'm tired. I just want to like Netflix binge watch something. Okay, great. Your learning curve, my learning curve, is important. And you need to actively do what you need to do to get on the learning curve. And simultaneously know that pain, suffering, and actual death is occurring while you are learning. Right? Like maybe that's a good motivating force, is that when you find an area that you don't know very much about, you will be learning about the area while that form of discrimination, pain, and suffering is still in existence. So it doesn't freeze while you're learning about it, which hopefully is the fuel it takes to get through the learning process, which also never ends, nor does the pain and suffering. But it is actually the right thing to do. That's what I mean by doing your homework. Knowing yourself and your patterns and your comfort zones and your discomfort zones allows you to know what you don't know. You begin to get comfortable not knowing something. When I get asked a lot, like, how do I prepare in advance to become uncomfortable? That's a very privileged question, because there is no preparation for your discomfort. It's just your comfort level with your discomfort. Can you stay uncomfortable? Now, a lot of us are coming from subordinated or marginalized identities where we feel discomfort quite often because it's called survival in a lot of cases. And I encourage you, while you're doing work from your subordinated and marginalized places to live, where else are you privileged and where else are your dominant identities? And can you do something to get uncomfortable there? Can you challenge yourself to be uncomfortable from your dominant and privileged identities while also trying to live from your subordinated and marginalized identities? That is what it means to truly know yourself and what it means to allow yourself the space to know what you don't know. If we can do that, being an ally is about being comfortable with constantly finding out new things that you don't know about and being responsible for the time period of your obliviousness, being responsible for the period of which you feel like you are really having to learn new information, and being responsible for, like, oh, I should have known better, and being responsible for doing the work that is called ally or advocacy work. That's a lot. That is a big thing to ask for. So what if you do the best you can with what you got some of the time? It lowers the bar of a lot, but that is what being a better ally for all actually means. Now, again, you may have thoughts or comments or questions or specific identities related to your coworkers, related to your friends or family, related to politics or religion or the world in general. Again, you are welcome to text message me at 202-670-4262. This is a very subtle hint. You're welcome to do that. And in the meantime, we're going to have to figure out what to do with our lives. What are we going to do? Now, if we're like, action, I want you to stop putting pressure on yourself of being right or accurate 100% of the time and allow yourself to really screw up. Maybe even screw up so much that you don't find out about your screw up. You actually have to know about it yourself. No one's going to tell you about it. That is putting yourself out there. That's the risk. Now, the chart that I came up with that I think we've shared before, but the idea of making better connections isn't about winning conversations. It's about recognizing that in losing a conversation, because we still like this binary of win-lose, in failing, in offending someone, in doing something wrong, you can still improve your connection with someone else. I often get asked, like, what do we do so that we never offend anybody else? And that's impossible. Because even if you were to go move into a cave, your Aunt Mildred is going to be upset that you skipped her birthday party. You're going to offend someone. I have guaranteed I have offended someone just in this webinar. Happened, absolutely. And I've gotten comfortable with the fact that that is a reality and that I may or may not even find out about it or get followed up with. And I'm responsible for the choices that I'm making. I can improve or make a better connection even when I'm offensive because I am open and comfortable to the idea of being offensive. Now, legally speaking, we are not protected from being offended, and freedom of speech is literally protected speech that leads to more speech. So as long as we are still connecting with each other, I am legally protected to be a complete douche canoe until it actually has a threat of like physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual harm. That's where subjectivity comes in freedom of speech. I was a ceramics major, so I would not come to me for legal advice. However, just because it's legal doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. And you can accidentally or intentionally be an incredibly hurtful source to someone else in your life. But if you're not willing to claim responsibility for it, you're never going to improve the connection you actually have with that person. So the first step is to decide, I want to have a better connection. The tool you are going to use to have a better connection is an intentional conversation. There's lots of other options. But if you're going to try to have an intentional conversation, it's because you want to have a better connection. Then notice the next step isn't start talking. The next step is shut your face still and listen to them as if they're wise, because lo and behold, they are, and they actually know something that you don't know. So listen for that. Listen to them as if they're going to teach you something, as if you have something to learn from them. It'll change how you enter the conversation, which is the tool you've chosen to lead to the goal of being a better connected relationship. Once you have listened to them and attempted to learn from them from their perspectives that might be wildly different than yours, their life taught them to show up this way. Then and only then do you form your message. Do you decide what it is you're trying to say? When you decide what it is you're trying to say, what words you're going to use, and how you're going to say it, you also are going to gain clarity on the intended meaning of the thing that you're going to say after listening in the conversation that's going to lead hopefully to a better connection. You form the message and you're clear on the intention. Now you all, including me, we've had conversations where at the end of whatever it is that fell out of our face, we had to say, well, that's not what I meant. Did you know what you meant before you said it? No, probably not, because we rarely get clear on our intentions. Email is a great example of this. So when you write whatever you want and you actually backspace, you're rewriting as you're clarifying your intention. If you don't do this and you've already hit send, it's too late. Form your message. What is your intended meaning of your message? Then it goes out into the world. It leaves your fingers, your thumbs, your face, something. Then you're responsible, or perhaps it's not the first time you've miscommunicated with the same person, so you might have to reclaim or claim for the first time the responsibility of the impact of that message. It could be congruent, meaning you intended this and the impact is congruent with how you intended. Yay, success! That means you could have had a negative intention and it was received negatively. You could have a positive intention and it was received positively. Woohoo! But you are also responsible if it's incongruent, meaning your intention was negative, but it was received positively. Your intention was positive, but it was received negatively. You're responsible for the impact of the message, whether it is congruent or not congruent. It's your job to make space for that responsibility. Then you make meaning of the conversation. How'd that go? And then lastly, once you have kind of an idea or ideas of how that might have gone, trusting your instincts and then also questioning them, then you can actually have a conversation about what is the impact on the connection with this individual. Is it better or is it worse following that particular intentional conversation? That doesn't mean you're going to be accurate, but it's slowing down enough to ask yourself the questions you don't know the answers to, so that you can actually be present and intentional about the connection that you either did or did not improve in that given moment. If we slowed down enough to communicate this way, even 1% of the time, I believe we would not only dismantle systems of oppression, not only would the vernacular of ally, advocacy, accomplice, or co-conspirator, or what other new words, it wouldn't be about the labels, but it would be about knowing ourselves enough to provide space for whatever is about to happen, and to enter that space with curiosity and generosity, and to be vulnerable and authentic in that space and see what happens. Because you've done that self-work, you can enter that space in a curious, generous, authentic, and vulnerable way and see what happens. And the connection will improve because of it. That is the goal of being an ally. It's super hard work, but it is the goal. Now, if you want to text message now, later, whatever, again, the number is 202-670-4262. I want to make sure that you have this because we are at the end of the webinar series, that if I can do something to help, I really am available to help. I know I make jokes that y'all are not the most like question texting kind of group, generally speaking, and that's okay, but you might think of some later, so I want to make sure that it's available. But in the couple of minutes that we have left, I just want to see if there's any like comments or thoughts or conversation that anybody wants to have before we have to go. So if that is what being an ally is about, How is that similar to what you were expecting? How is that different than what you were expecting? How does that show up in your own life? I am asking questions I do not know the answers to. I'm glad you have enjoyed the series. That's awesome. It's also very awkward if you hadn't and you put it in the chat. This has been terrible. What a waste of 4 hours of my life. Just out of curiosity, because again, I don't know the answer to the question, are there any particular takeaways that you're kind of remembering or that you'll take from the series? That literally I don't know the answer to, but it'll be interesting just to see kind of what has stuck across the 4 hours.
I'm gonna unmute, but there's a dog crying and barking, so I apologize in advance.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, so I really liked kind of the deep dive into the golden rule and kind of clarification around what that means and how we should look at that. So that's probably what I remember the most. The other piece, which is something I've been working on as well, is kind of like when you're having a conversation with anybody, you don't need to be the expert and you shouldn't want to be the expert in that conversation. So you should always approach an interaction with a learning perspective versus a judging perspective. So that was kind of in that last piece there. So that's super helpful. And I think that that has contributed a lot to like positive communication.
Yeah. It's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from my husband is the idea of charity. I don't even know how to say the word because I'm such an egomaniac. So I very early on in our dating life, we were at dinner with someone. Remember going to dinner, and somebody was talking about hiking and climbing mountains and things like this. And so first off, zero interest in this entire topic. So I'm like, okay, I'll just eat my food. So I'm just eating my food. So my husband was in the Peace Corps in Nepal, has gone to every trail in the Himalayas at least twice. When he turned 55, he and his best friend had one more to do for the third time, and it was Annapurna Trail. Did it, hurt his ankle, so he did the entire thing in flip-flops. This is who my husband is, right? I know this about him. Don't make a face. He had to choose between shoe wear, and he did the whole thing. I think he should write a letter to the people who made their reef, the ones that have the bottle openers on the bottom. Anyway, he did the entire 6-week Annapurna hike in bottle opener reefs. Don't you think he should at least get a free pair? Anyway, my point is that we're sitting there at dinner. Somebody is talking about hiking like a hill in Idaho as the highest peak that they've ever done, and they're super proud of themselves. And I sat there and was waiting to be like the proud wife of this crazy person who just did Annapurna like 2 years earlier in a pair of flip-flops. And my husband never talked about the Himalayas, ever. Never came up. You know why? Because that would have been insulting to the person who was really excited about sharing what it was like to peak whatever this hill is in Idaho. I looked it up. It doesn't even register as a mountain. That's me being egotistical about sharing my husband's expertise to like slay this guy's like ego who thinks this hill is a big deal. Why do I have a dog in this fight? Why am I talking about animals fighting? What is happening? This is ridiculous, but it happens, and it doesn't provide space for this person to share their joy about what happened when they got to the top of this thing I can't even find on a map. The idea of being charitable, that doesn't take away my husband's experience. It doesn't take away his expertise, but it's because of his experience and his expertise that he knows what it feels like to like overcome a challenge, and he can meet there even though the yardage that a mountain is measured in, however many, whatever, you know what I'm talking about. They can bond over what it feels like to like, I can't get to the top of it, and oh look, now I'm at the top of it. Isn't that about a connection versus like a pin in the map of like, do you see the difference there? And like slowing down enough to share that moment. I would never have gotten there Because I would be like, oh, well, let me show you my mountaineering resume. Right? Who wants to engage with me if I'm leading with my resume? The idea is to be able to connect with the actual person. And you can do that regardless of whether you're talking about a hill or Mount Everest, because it's the same kind of emotional experience or spiritual experience that they can share on, which is a deeper connection than exchanging facts. You have to be vulnerable enough and reflective enough to be able to hold that kind of space. And maybe you can do it some of the time. That's better than never. Other thoughts or comments or critiques about mountaineering gear? Well, this has been a particularly fun and enjoyable series. I enjoy this largely because I have clients often I can't relate to in any way whatsoever. And getting a physical therapist is like getting a new hairstylist every time I move because it's just required in our relationship. So thank you for the work that you are doing. And for continuing to do it in the middle of a time where people's physical ability to like take care of themselves is probably more emotional and spiritual needed than before. Morgan, your dog is adorable. And Bruna, I don't have a podcast largely because I hate technology, but I do have a ton of videos on YouTube if that is interesting to you. You also probably could trade off and shelter in place with me because one poor human has to listen to me 24/7 for 6 months. Send help or beer. All right. Thank you very much. Do the best you can with what you got some of the time.
Thanks, Jess. That's awesome. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.